Oh, can you hear me now? All right, thank you, William. I don't know what is going on. I'm getting all kinds of weird warnings about degraded audio quality. So hopefully that's all we need to do. Now I can get rid of this audio check. It won't let me get rid of the audio check. This is great. Anyway, I'll start over since I thought everybody was able to hear me. I'm just trying to figure out what to do about how many of you can see this? Thanks, William. William tells me to get rid of Windows. I really don't think that's the issue. I think there's just as many problems with GoTo as there is the operating system. I'm just, hold on while I try to get rid of this. Geez. Why will this not go away? Can you guys see this sound check thing? If you can't see it, I guess, well, that makes it impossible for me to see my own screen, though. Oh, my God. Who can you see the sound check screen, though? That's the problem. What is going on? Hold on. I got to see if I can get rid of this sound check thing because it's set up in task. Yeah, got that, buddy. Oh my God. Well, I've never had this stuck in front of me. I can't even, oh, there. All right, I can at least move it and get it out of the way. All right, geez. Oh my God. All right, well, so to start off with, good evening or afternoon, wherever you might be. Tonight, Hannah Miller, who's our host, is not going to be joining us. She's had a very long day, so I told her I would take care of it. The password for tonight is Mr. Rogers. It's the 50th anniversary of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, first broadcast on what would become PBS. I thought that would be a fitting tribute to a beloved man. Tonight we will look at, oh no, Ebony can't hear either. Oh, well, Courtney can hear, William can hear, Ray can hear. Peggy, everybody else seems to hear fine. So I'm going to tell Ebony to try logging in again. Let's see if that works. Okay. Thank you, Nicole. Thanks, everybody. I think everybody else is fine. So I did switch to telephone to get, sometimes, whatever, the glitch is just switching from one mode to the other and everything's fine after that. In any case, tonight I'm going to discuss the murals of the Hospicio Cabanas Institute in Guadalajara, Mexico. These were done by Jose Clemente Orozco. We'll talk a little bit about the background of the artist, not much, but a little bit, because this is a massive mural series of 57 individual panels, so we've got a lot to cover in a short amount of time. Before we start, I did just want to, I'm going to turn on, hopefully, if I can get, I'm going ahead, sorry, just so I can get the, oh, of course, it's probably hidden. I had this all set up, man. I'll tell you. I even got in here 20 minutes early to get it all set up perfectly. It never fails. I think what I need to do is probably go to a hidden page. There we go. I'm just going to unhide it so I don't have to keep going in and out of the mode. All right, back to it. If we're lucky, this will go to where it was supposed to be in the first place. All right. I just want to give you a sense of the building itself. I'm going to pause that, move it. Oh, not that one. Just to give you a sense of the building itself, I'm going to let this kind of go on in the background while I continue to talk a little bit. This is the interior. So this is why I'm saying we've got a lot to cover. There are pretty much every inch of the ceiling and most of the walls have been painted. So Peggy, you can't see this at all? Can anybody else see what's going on right now? Wow. Well, maybe it's the full screen mode. I'm going to go back to not. Can everybody see this okay? Huh. Well, that's interesting. I'm going to turn off my screen, share it again. So everybody can see the title page with my name, Mr. Rogers. All right. Now let's, if I go, this is ridiculous. So nobody can see this. So everybody can see the website that I'm looking at, yes? Okay, good. Well, hopefully, if it's full screen, can you see it? Everybody still sees it? All right, we're making some progress. I'm just going to leave it right there. I'm afraid if I do anything else, we'll screw it up. So this is the interior. I'm just going to let this rotate for a second. So you get a sense of the interior, although it just wants to do its own thing, whatever. Get a sense of just the interior space. You can see that this is a traditional barrel vaulted, it's not quite a basilica, but a barrel vaulted neoclassical structure. Originally a church that was then turned into an orphanage. It is now a cultural center. So it's been through many phases over time. But just want to give you a sense of what we're looking at. What we're going to explore today is a portrait of a people. I wrote this, I researched this for my master's thesis a long time ago, mid-90s. I finished my thesis, I think, in 98, if I recall. And I focused exclusively on this as a portrait of the Mexican people as a consequence of or product of the conflict or the confrontation between the indigenous peoples and the Spanish conquest. So Orozco was, I'm sure, I hope people have heard of Orozco's name, maybe not, but you certainly have heard of Diego Rivera, who was his contemporary. Diego Rivera, and Siqueiros were members of what they called the Big Three, the Tres Grandes. For me, personally, I'm biased, obviously, but I find Orozco the most compelling of the three, the most, how would I put it, authentic in some ways. Rivera was kind of a showboat and obviously a philanderer and had his own issues and kind of switched loyalties to this or that political party depending on what seemed most beneficial to himself. Orozco didn't play those games. He was always an apolitical idealist, and thought that the political controversies and the political argumentation and infighting were destroying Mexico. So he was much more of, I would say, a commentator, an apolitical commentator, and tried to reveal through his art the power of the Mexican people, the potential of the Mexican people, and even maybe the faults of the Mexican people, particularly insofar as there seemed to be a never-ending battle between different groups of people. And you can look at the history of Mexico from the revolution in 1811 all the way up until, basically up until present time, that there's been just a high turnover in terms of presidents. There's been multiple revolutions. So there's just been a lot of conflict, and Orozco happened to be painting around the turn of the century, the second major revolution, early 1900s into the 1940s. So he was there seeing a lot of student uprising, a lot of communist uprising going on in conflict in Mexico at the time. Orozco is a classicist on the one hand. He's a mixture of a lot of things, which is one of the most intriguing aspects of him as an artist, I think. He's a classicist. He's rooted in classical training. And obviously a lot of his work is housed inside of classical architecture or neoclassical architecture. He's also a social realist in the sense that a lot of his work, or most of his work, deals directly with social issues, political issues, and trying to reflect on the troubles and turmoil affecting everyday people. And he's also an expressionist. His work is very expressionistic. So there's a lot of kind of not contradictory so much as maybe different pulls that are taking Orozco in different directions on some level, but he is a master synthesis, including not just his art, I would say, but his attitude and his vision, his philosophical vision for what the Mexican people could achieve. And this isn't obviously my personal opinion, because I never met the guy, but it is very clear in reading about other people's opinion of Orozco that he was considered a man of absolutely deep, deep personal integrity, both artistic, but also I think just ethical and moral integrity, which again is something that I find incredibly appealing, and especially in today's atmosphere, all of a sudden, it's kind of refreshing to look back at a person who kind of lived up to the greatest human ideals. And I would say most of all, Orozco was a proud mestizo. And mestizo, for those who don't know, this is the hybrid culture that comes out of the clash between the indigenous, say, Aztec, Maya, Toltec, Mixtec, Tlaxcalan. There's a lot of different tribal groups, indigenous groups that existed when Cortés and the Spanish first invaded. But that hybrid culture that comes out of it is called mestizaje. And the people would be mestizo people, a mixture of both. And upwards of 90% of Mexicans are mestizo. There are very few purely indigenous or purely Creole or Spanish. The vast majority are mestizo or mix. If anybody has questions, feel free to throw them into the questions area. And this isn't the only mural series. I'm kind of pulling together a couple of different ones to give an overall portrait of at least Orozco's vision of the portrait of the Mexican people. He's painted an important series at University or Dartmouth College, where he is looking at the origins of the New World, essentially, and looks at Aztec and indigenous mythology, And one of the most important figures of Toltec and Aztec and Mayan it's not Quetzalcoatl, it's a different figure, but the same, it's kind of like the Romans and the Greeks, how the Romans adopted certain gods and the pantheon from the Greeks. The Aztecs and other groups that came after the Maya also adopted many of the gods and mythology, much of the mythology of the Maya. So Quetzalcoatl is perhaps not the single most, but certainly one of the most important of the pantheon of Aztec and Toltec culture. Just briefly, there's more here than I really want to talk about. What I really want to focus in is on the second myth of Quetzalcoatl. So Quetzalcoatl is one of the creator gods. He and basically his twin, Tezcatlipoca, is the kind of the evil twin. Quetzalcoatl is the good twin, or the light twin, versus the dark twin. And he was considered associated with education, enlightenment, hence the light one. And there's a myth of, and these two were always at odds with one another. And Tezcatlipoca tried to trick his brother, and eventually we end up with Quetzalcoatl going into self-exile, basically abandoning his people and abandoning, not what we call Mexico today. So he is exiled. He leaves. He goes to the east, what would have considered the big water of the Atlantic Ocean. But he promises that one day he will return. Now, this is important because this plays into the conquest, and certainly plays into the hands of the Spanish and Cortés, because the myth or the legend of Quetzalcoatl kind of coincides with the arrival of the Spanish, and they were able to exploit these beliefs in the return of Quetzalcoatl, and spread rumors and convince certain peoples that this was a return of one of their most important gods. You can imagine that would have been a very powerful, given our own, say, relationship with Christianity and the idea of the second coming. It's a very similar kind of concept that's going on. Now, what's interesting about this, so Cortés arrives in a year called a one-reed year, and that is why it became convincing that Quetzalcoatl might actually be returning. This is Quetzalcoatl departing. He was said to have departed on a raft of snakes, and you can see him kind of standing on this raft of rattlesnakes, and his people are. Part of the issue was that his brother insisted on blood sacrifice. Quetzalcoatl never wanted blood sacrifice. He thought it was brutal and savage. And when he came across his people giving blood sacrifice, this was, in one of the versions anyway, this is the reason for him to depart. It was as though because his people were practicing what he considered brutal ritual, that he was going to abandon them for that, because he's the god of light, god of enlightenment. So he leaves. You've got the image here painted by Orozco of him pointing to the east, and telling of course, his followers are fearful, and they're depicted kind of dark and kind of almost primordial in some sense, to give a sense of the perspective, the perspective from Quetzalcoatl. So here he is departing. So this is very important for kind of establishing this origin myth of the modern mestizo. So he writes, Orozco writes, like victims of amnesia, we haven't found out who we are. We go on classifying as Indians, Creoles, and mestizos, following bloodlines only, as if we were discussing racehorses. And the effect of the classification is to divide us into implacable partisan groups, the Hispanists and the Indigenous, who wore to the death. And this was clearly a very troubling thing for Orozco. I mean, I think this really tore him apart inside for his entire life, quite honestly. I think witnessing the violence and the endless conflict was a driving force in his life. And much of his art is about trying to figure out a way to resolve this visually so that it could be kind of almost a therapeutic aid to the Mexican people, his people. So he wrote extensively about these issues. So we know very, very well, I think, what his feelings were about this deep partisan divide. And I think, you know, this is something that is perennial. This is kind of a universal human condition. And I think we all right now are going through a period where we see it more starkly and more acutely than probably any time in our lifetimes, certainly in my lifetime. So it's kind of a universal parable even about the human condition and a warning to everyone, which is another reason why I love the work of Orozco so much, because it has a universality to it that we can all understand. You know, I suppose you could go back to, I didn't grow up in the 60s. I wasn't alive in the 60s, but we could certainly maybe look back to the 1960s and the culture wars, the civil rights movement, and the clashes that were occurring then as another example, and maybe one more based on the racial divide in a similar way that Orozco is describing here. But the political partisanship and the divisions that exist within a culture, I think, are, you know, very clearly evident today. So the myth of Quetzalcoatl was something that was exploited by Cortés and the Spanish, and this is often, at least in legend, blamed on, I guess, the woman Malinche. And La Malinche, if anybody knows anything about Mexico, La Malinche is one of the worst things you can say to somebody. It's a traitor to your people. I mean, this is a very deeply cutting, offensive accusation or epithet you can say to someone. So here we've got a picture of, or portrait of, obviously this never happened, this is a mythic portrait of the origin of the mestizo, or of mestizaje. So we've got Cortés and Malinche kind of in this primordial union of this new race of people. You may have heard the term La Raza. This was a term, La Raza Cosmica, the cosmic race, was this new race that was created out of this collision of two cultures. On the bottom, I think what we're seeing is essentially the product of, this is the mestizo. But for Orozco, this is a nascent form. This is an unfinished or inchoate form, an undeveloped or unfulfilled existence or identity, which is why he's face down. I don't think Orozco ever gave an interpretation. I mean, you could look at it as an interpretation, perhaps, of the death caused by this clash. I look at it, though, as this is the child of these two figures, the indigenous and the Spanish. But you may notice here there's a lot of kind of Edenic or biblical kind of references here. They are clearly, metaphorically, the Adam and Eve of Mexico, of the mestizo. So Malinche was attributed with, what nice way of putting it, revealing the myth of Quetzalcoatl. And Malinche was from a different tribe than the Aztecs. She was a Tlaxcalan Indian who had been constantly attacked by the Aztecs. The Aztecs were a very formidable empire. They were very brutal. They would often engage in what were called the flowery wars, and that was very often simply to take captives so that they could be sacrificed to the gods. So many of the tribes that existed around the Aztec Empire were under constant threat and under constant fear of attack. So this is one of those situations of the enemy of my enemy is my friend. So there was this bond that was created between the coastal Tlaxcalan and the invading conquistadors. But Malinche in this portrait here is not a traitor so much as the mother, the Eve of all of Mexico, modern Mexico, or Mexico, I suppose. So the mural cycle that we're going to look at, again, produced by Jose Clemente Orozco, who was a native of the state of Jalisco. In 1937, he was invited by the government to paint the old chapel of what's now called the Cabanas Institute, Cultural Institute. And in about a year and a half, he had completed this massive undertaking. You know, I call it his, I don't know if he would call it that, but I call it his Sistine Chapel, because it was truly an epic amount of work. And he's working in al fresco, and al fresco is wet plaster with pigments. So you have to work very quickly. You have to know exactly what you're doing. There's no room for mistake, or little room for mistake, I'll say. And there are 57 individual panels, including 6 large panels in the barrel vault and then 2 others in the transept. And what he presents here is essentially a type of Hegelian dialectical history. And I'll explain the dialectic a little bit more, just so you understand what I mean by that. But it's a Hegelian dialectic or perspective of history of Mexico, from the Mesoamerican Spanish conquest to the revolution, and then ultimately to what he saw and others saw, Vasconcelos, the Minister of Education, saw as the cosmic race. And that's why I call this a portrait of a people. And I'm going to show you the 360, or the panoramic view again in a little bit. But to give you an understanding of what why this is kind of couched in terms of the historical dialectic, one of the panels on the ground floor, and there are what, 12 of them, yeah, in the nave of the chapel. One of the panels kind of is what I would consider the starting point, or the central beginning point of his historical dialectic, called the Wheel of Time. And the Wheel of Time is just the endless forward momentum of time itself. And it's the wheel because it tends to operate cyclically. History may repeat itself. We kind of go through the same processes over and over and over, hopefully in a progression, not simply a kind of a static position, spinning our wheels, so to speak, but in a gradual progression, moving ever higher in terms of consciousness. And this is really what this portrait is. It's about the consciousness of the Mestizo people, of the Mexican people. So you see here the Wheel of Time here, and it's kind of doing its thing. And then underneath is the kind of endless clash of what we call the thesis and the antithesis. The old being buried by the new over and over and over. So you've got these kind of strata of history being compressed and added onto and compressed, kind of like a landfill. Not necessarily a great image to attach to it, but that's kind of what it is, this strata of history that's just constantly being accumulated over time. And I'm showing you 2. The one on the left is from that panorama, just because of the lighting is kind of nice and crisp. You got this under lighting that wasn't present, or isn't as easily. I don't even know if it was present when I was there. I don't remember any lighting at all. So I don't know if that's a recent addition or if they just weren't on the day I was there. In any case, so this is kind of the origin point of his image of the dialectic. So the dialectic is a historical philosophy, a philosophy of history, originated by George Friedrich Hegel, German Enlightenment philosopher, metaphysical philosopher, who looked at history as a series of events that were constantly reproducing conflict between the thesis, and the thesis we can think of as the status quo. That is the existing default world we live in. The antithesis is always that thing that rises up to challenge it. Revolutions are the antithesis, or an antithesis. The Cultural Revolution of the 1960s was a type of antithesis, something that rises up to challenge the existing power structures or dynamics that are present. And through that clash, whether it be violent, whether it be cultural, whether it be purely political, whether it be military or physical, through that clash eventually emerges a synthesis of the two things. And for Orozco, that synthesis is the modern Mexican people, the mestizaje, the mestizo. So through this clash of the Spanish and the indigenous came about the Mexican people, which is a new thing. This didn't exist before. It kind of buried, in some sense, these individual essences that were meeting and confronting one another. So this is Hegel kind of describing briefly what this thing is that moves through time, and he calls it the spirit or the Geist. You may have heard the term Zeitgeist. So the spirit or the Geist is the consciousness that moves through time. So the spirit, devouring its worldly envelope, not only passes into another envelope, not only arises rejuvenated from the ashes of its embodiment, but it emerges from them exalted, transfigured, a purer spirit. So what he's suggesting here is that each time the thesis and the antithesis clash and become and form a new synthesis, that it's reached another level or another plateau or another stage. But there's something purifying about the clash itself that creates a purer spirit. But again, that new spirit will still come to meet another antithesis and go through another series of conflicts. Again, this is a philosophy of history, so that there's the Volkgeist is the spirit of a people, the Zeitgeist is the spirit of the time that kind of overarches or encapsulates or envelops the Volkgeist, or the spirit of the people. But that every era or every time has an end. It will also succumb to the conflict of its own antithesis, and will then again need to go through conflict to emerge in a new of the awareness of a new zeitgeist. I hope this is all clear and I'm not putting you all to sleep. Again, feel free to post any comments or questions in the questions area. Oh, I forgot. I should probably check the chat. I closed that. So as you enter the ceilings of the transept, we've got the indigenous religion. This is, or the dustbin. I call it the dustbin of religion, because you can see here what appears to be maybe some, I don't know, Western classical, perhaps, religious idols, some indigenous or Aztec, Mayan, indigenous or indigenous religious figures or idols. So for Orozco, he's kind of suggesting that religion is something to be transcended here, and that religion, as we'll see in other panels, religion is in some ways the cause of much of this conflict. Clearly, the idea of conquest had a lot to do with not simply the physical conquest, but the spiritual conquest of Mesoamerica, or modern day Mexico, what we call Mexico today. So we've got images of, here we've got indigenous rituals, They're kind of gruesome if you look at them closely. They, a group of people appear to be tearing the heart out of a sacrificial individual. But of course, Christianity and Catholicism do not escape his criticism. So you've got this kind of amalgamation of religion kind of merging, and in the middle here you can notice a human figure, and this is kind of what I would kind of consider the consequence of two strong religious points of view or perspectives or ethos combining in the individual, him or herself. You can imagine how confusing this would have been to see the missionary zeal of the Spanish missionaries in their efforts to convert, and it was a very brutal conversion. And you can imagine having your own religion being ripped from you or being forced from you, and no longer being allowed to practice it, what that might do to your psychological health. And suddenly you're being told, I mean, I think anybody might be able to relate to this. Suddenly you're being told that your religion no longer exists, or that your religion isn't real, what you believe in isn't true. And it now being supplanted by a new religion. And this is what you're supposed to believe in. This is the true religion. So I think what Orozco here is doing is kind of showing the psychological damage that comes through this this clash just of the religious side of a human being, the spiritual side of a human being, kind of trapped in between, immobilized by the pull of, or the gravity of the two religious perspectives or dispositions. I'll talk about the rest of those later, but on the other side, this is Quetzalcoatl. This is Coatlicue. This is a she of the serpent skirt. This is a very powerful goddess of the Aztec world. Some of you may have seen this was actually buried in modern-day Mexico City. This was buried along with the rubble and the remains of most of the original architecture and statuary that was there. Much of it was just dismantled and used to build churches and roads and the cathedral and everything else that we now see in modern Mexico. But this was buried and rediscovered in the mid or early 20th century, I think. It took quite a while. And there are many versions of it, but you may have seen this either in photographs or if you've ever visited Mexico City. It's one of the most important archaeological discoveries, I think, of the 20th century. In any case, so this is Coatlicue. This is kind of and you can see again, you've got this pot with human remains being boiled in it, kind of referring to the probably false belief of cannibalism. I don't think that there's any evidence that cannibalism was practiced at the time of conquest, but it's still a part of the popular mythology of the Aztecs, that they, cut people up, boiled them up, and ate them. And so anyway, he's depicting just these kind of what he considers the brutality of all religion. That the Aztecs were nothing to idealize or to romanticize. And I think that this was what he saw as part of the problem, was that either the indigenous were clinging to this kind of mythic, romantic vision of the indigenous world as somehow being superior. Then you had the Creoles or the Hispanics on the other side, who were elevating the Western tradition and Catholicism and all of this. And this was one of the central issues that made it appear as though there was no way to get past these conflicts. Here you've got images of two monks, and below, which you can't see very well, are what one would assume are two bodies of indigenous peoples or mestizo people, again, kind of writhing on the ground, and in some cases not fully formed, like as though parts of their bodies had been removed. So this is really, I think, just a critique of religion in general and how religion can be used as a means of control, how religion very often divides people. And, you know, I think we clearly see that today. When you look at conflict between the Palestinians and the Israelis. I mean, religion is one of humankind's most potent, weaponized traditions. Here we start to see the themes that Orozco wants to lay out as fundamental to the creation of the mestizo culture, of mestizaje. On the far left, we have, make sure I got these right. So I would call these three scenes of evangelization. Obviously, you've got Carlos V kind of clinging to, like, hugging the cross, the Christian cross or the Catholic cross. His crown is resting on the cross to give a sense of validity or divine ordainment. So he's clinging to the cross, obviously as the leader of Spain and the person ultimately responsible for the conquest itself. On the other side, and I'll show you this reversed in a bit. On the other side, we've got a mechanical angel or an armored angel, a Catholic monk, Franciscan monk, holding a cross. We'll get into that in a second. And then another image of the actual physical conquest, the battle over bodies, the destruction of bodies in the process of that. But combined, this is both a spiritual and a physical conquest, ostensibly, at least couched in terms of it being a religious conquest. Of course, we all know that it had a hell of a lot to do with power and gold and money and staking of claims. But it was always easier just to kind of say it's a religious thing. So we can see much more clearly here what is being depicted. So we've got this angel coming in, kind of an arc over the top of this Franciscan monk. He's holding a cross, but it looks like it's made of sword blades, which I find, you know, Orozco is wonderful at these tiny little details that say volumes. And of course, the bottom is the sharpest, and it's being held right above the back of this supplicant, which we would assume is an indigenous supplicant, and always nude. And I think that the symbolism that's involved here is, and again, lots that we can kind of relate to: power differentials, the fragility, the vulnerability of the nude body, particularly when you're looking at this scene where all of the conquistadors are like mechanized robots, and all of the indigenous are practically nude, obviously not wearing any armor at all, but just a brutal vision of the power difference that was involved. You know, you had literally a handful of conquistadors that were able to bring down, I don't remember what the number was exactly, but I think it was under 250 conquistadors who were able to essentially take down the entire Aztec empire. And again, a lot of it had to do with the ability to exploit the myth of Quetzalcoatl and other things. Okay, so the monk, I think I've made that pretty clear. The angel is holding ABCD, which includes or alludes to the educational aspects, quote unquote, of the Catholic mission to bring education and enlightenment, also a sense of superiority, and also I think emphasizing the perceived superiority of literacy as understood by the Spanish at the time. This is the Los Caballos, or Caballos, translated as the horses. And what Orozco has done here is created a two-headed horse, and a lot of people, and I don't know that this is technically a fact of interpretation on the part of Orozco, but some scholars have suggested that in American Spanish, a caballo is also means a stupid or a brutal person, a mean person. And many scholars believe that there's some kind of play on words here, that he's kind of utilizing. Of course, Orozco spent a lot of time in the United States. He did many paintings here in the United States as well. So he was, and he knew English, so he certainly would have been cognizant or aware of alternatives of Mexican Spanish or American Spanish. That's not necessarily the case, but I think that that's certainly an interesting translation, if nothing else. So the results of this conquest are a kind of a cycle of vengeance, and what I think Orozco considered kind of a civil war that never ends or never ended. And he wrote, at any given moment, the conquest looms more immediate than the forays of Pancho Villa, which at this time was only 3 decades earlier. So this is still recent history. The attack upon the great Teocalli, the Noche Triste, and the destruction of Tenochtitlan did not take place early in the 16th century, but just last year. So he's kind of alluding to this, I don't know what you call it, a cultural grudge that has persisted for centuries at this point. And again, alluding back to that warring mentality, the bellicose nature of this conflict between the indigenous identity and the Spanish identity or the Creole identity. Then we have the conquest of America. So this is more the physical side. The other was more on the spiritual side, the evangelical conquest. This would be the physical conquest. I'm going to go through these because we're getting close to the end. I'm talking too much, apparently. So this is an image of Cortés, who's depicted not just as an armored conquistador, but as almost as a robot, as a cyborg. Again, emphasizing kind of the mechanical power. And he's got this massive sword. And there's this weird void. I find this very compelling. This weird void, as though he's got no heart. Like there's nothing, there's no emotion in this person. He is purely running on mechanical instinct here. There's no compassion. And you can see these bodies that have been hacked up, missing limbs, missing body parts, kind of strewn all over the floor. This image has been described as, again, a mechanical angel, which could be the voice of Catholicism, of divine right, a type of manifest destiny of some sort, that this is his destiny and God has ordained it. Others have also interpreted as maybe a figure of Malinche herself in the garb of the mechanical angel. This is the bellicosidad, and again, you've got just this spiraling juggernaut. You can just see this thing rolling across the landscape, just hacking everything in its way. You've got gears, lots of different just armor. You can see this figure here. Here's his legs, kind of arcing up into a spiral. But just this mass of swords and helmets and armor just barreling across the landscape. Again, to give this sense of the overwhelming superiority in arms. They also had cannon, so they, and muskets. This is why it was it was possible for such a small group of people to conquer the mighty Aztec Empire. And you can imagine, having never seen these things. That's another thing I didn't mention, but I will in a second with the next image. To me, this is the most powerful image of the whole group. I find this just incredibly powerful. This is called the Mechanized Horse, and we've got, and it's a mechanized horse in terms of like an iron horse. He's riding on rails, so he's making a connection here, not only between the horse, but between horse and kind of horsepower and the iron horse on riding on rails. And again, it's just this mass of gears, and I don't know if there's an exhaust pipe in there, chains just dripping out from underneath it, as though in its wake, you know, even the tail, in its wake, it leaves nothing but bondage and death and carnage. What's interesting here too is note that the figure is essentially a single unit, and the Aztecs had never seen horses before. You have to remember, right, that there were no horses, there were no beasts of burden in the New World. No ox, no cow. Dogs were about the only type of animal that was used in any capacity. So horses were never seen before, and on top of them, you've got this shiny armored thing, and the horse themselves were also armored. So from the Aztec perspective, they had no idea what this thing was. They didn't see these things as a person on a horse. They saw these things as a terrifying monster, monstrosity. And what I also love about this, you've got the flag of Spain that's being carried up here, and then he's got his arm, you can't see, and extending a sword, which is like a plow. And you can just see body parts kind of, you can imagine this kind of digging furrows into the landscape. Yes, Etta. Now this is one of the things that I interpreted this, that I never found anybody else to identify. Come here. There's a theme of the triumph of death that comes out of the period of the plague in Europe. So I just want to show you that I think what he's doing here is referencing, and he had traveled to Italy, so he very certainly could have seen some of these images. But what I think he's doing is suggesting that the conquest was a type of plague that decimated and destroyed the indigenous culture. Yeah, you can't go out right now. So this is by Aubrecht Durer, 1505. Gives you an example. Now here, I don't remember if it was noted where he visited. It's been a while since I've done research on this, but in the monastery of St. Benedict, this is called the Sacro Speco. This is built into the side of a mountain. It's one place I absolutely want to see before I die. But notice the similarities in terms of the walls and the ceilings. If Orozco didn't see this, he must have known about it, because it clearly, there seems to be some resonance between what he accomplished and achieved in the Cabanas Institute and what we see here. But note in this, you can see it right here. It's on this wall right here. There's another triumph of death figure. This is always a skeleton riding a horse, typically killing a lot of people and then trampling over dead people. But it's an image of the plague. This is from around 1350. Another one, the most terrifying of them all. I mean, this makes The Walking Dead kind of look saccharine. This is from Palermo in Sicily around 1450. I'm going to show you a better picture. This was before it had lost a lot of the pigment. But again, you've got this figure. He's just let off an arrow that's traveled and stabbed this poor soul in the neck. But again, this is an image of the triumph of death during the plague in Europe. And there are dozens and dozens and dozens of these. So there's no way that Orozco didn't know about them, and it's unlikely that he didn't see them on his travels. So I am convinced that that's what he's doing. He's making a reference both to the mechanized locomotive that would come, the mechanization of Western culture before it arrived. And then even before he painted this, everybody knew Posada. So Jose Guadalupe Posada, the most famous print artist in all of Mexico. You've seen his work, the Calavera. He's done hundreds and hundreds of these. This is a Don Quixote Calavera, but again, very similar in terms of what we're seeing in that image of the mechanized horse. And this would have been something any Mexican who'd walked in that building and seen the mechanized horse would have instantly recognized it as related to Posada's Don Quixote, which I think adds yet another layer of kind of innuendo or a double entendre, poking fun and derision at the folly of conquest itself. So again, just to give you a different perspective on that. So another quote from Orozco: "In the political field, another war without quarter, another struggle for power and wealth, subdivisions ad infinitum of the factions, unrestrained desire for vengeance, underground intrigues between the friends of today and the enemies of tomorrow, mutually eager to exterminate one another when the opportunity arises." You know, what he's describing in many ways is just a kind of psychologically dysfunctional culture that he is desperately seeking a way to heal. Here we've got Charity on the left. This is Cabanas himself, the person who the building is named after, who started the orphanage. So you got all of these poor people who are bringing the children because they are unable to take care of them. You've got human suffering. He may be making a connection between, you know, this kind of paternalism and the perpetuation of human suffering, the dependency that maybe Charity can rot potentially. And then ultimately what happens in the wake of human suffering is you have the rise of demagogues. And we all know about that. I'll leave it at that. So on the opposite side, he takes it to the next level. What happens after you have the rise of demagogues? Now you have the dictators, the militarized masses, and despotism. And you've got these in sequence here. So he's warning of the cycles that arise out of this. And he wants to show in visual form how to overcome, how to transcend. And he does that through the human spirit. The pendentives, these figures here, are, there's indigenous features on one of them, or maybe two of them. Two of them you can't really see their face, but indigenous features on one of them that you can see in the looking at you, and then there's Spanish features on the other. There's a beard here. But what he's depicting here is this kind of spiritual striving. Even though they've got the weapons of war, they're climbing. They're trying to reach something higher. They're trying to get out. But it's as though they're being prevented from reaching it, partly because of the weapons, and maybe because they're clinging to this realm of the old world, and instead of rising to the new. The actual transcendent path is human creativity, and that's in the base of the dome. So you've got the human arts, statuary, printmaking, books, sculpture. So he's got basically all of the human arts. There's theater is included in there as well. You can see it a little bit more clearly here. But again, this is human culture. This is art. This is all and music. This is the beautiful things that human beings do. And through that, he's suggesting a path forward, a path up and out to the transcendent world of the man of fire. So this is his kind of ultimate, I think, interpretation of what we see in the dome of the Hospicio Cabanas Institute. He writes, "The art of the New World cannot take root in the old traditions of the Old World, nor in Aboriginal traditions represented by the remains of our ancient Indian peoples. Although the art of all races and of all times has common value, human, universal, each new cycle must work for itself, must create, must yield its own production, its individual share to the common good. If new races have appeared upon the lands of the New World, such races have the unavoidable duty to produce a new art and a new spiritual and physical medium. Any other road is plain cowardice." And again, this goes right back to the idea of the wheel of time. And this idea that the old cannot sustain us, that we must be creators of our new world, that we are here to be creators of culture, and that it's imperative that we do so, and we do so through positive means, through culture. And by doing so, we can heal the past. Here we've got the four elements: elemental man. We've got the man of water, the man of earth, the man of air, which you can barely make out, who's kind of a bridge between the two. You can see one arm on the man of earth, which we can associate with indigenous features and the indigenous people. We've got the man of water, obviously sailing across the sea, again, bridging, but kind of at odds. But then note that their hands almost touch. This is certainly a reference, at least subtly, to Michelangelo and Adam, where the fingers are almost touching. So there's a sense here of completing the circle, that these are touched, and as soon as they touch, that will kind of light the man of fire. And the man of fire is transcendent man, transcendent humans. The ability to rise above the partisan bickering of the past to create a new world. And I find it, absolutely one of the most optimistic works of art that's ever been produced. And I think that his hope simply was that this image could be a catalyst to remind not just the Mexican people, but all people, the good that humanity can achieve, and the obligation we all have to strive and to overcome our own discomfort, our own internal disequilibrium, our own conflicts with others, our own prejudices and bigotry. And I think it speaks just as powerfully to us today as it has since its creation. It's only been about 100 years. But I think that this is why I am so thoroughly impressed by the universal nature of Orozco's work here and in other sites. I'm not going to get into this. We're already at 5 after, so if there's any questions, I'm more than happy to field questions. That's just an explanation of Hegel's idea of the absolute and the achievement of consciousness, which I think is visually represented by this series. All right. Any questions, or I'm happy to stick around if you would like to say anything. I hope that I hope everybody can still hear me, and that the screen didn't go blank or something. Jared says a circle of people holding hands could also be a sign of unity or the need for unity. Absolutely. I keep thinking things to comment, but you are doing good. Oh, thanks. I appreciate it. Oh, thank you, Peggy. Michael, no problem. You're welcome, Marcia. I'm glad you enjoyed it. The survey will be sent out, Nicole, after we get off of this. There should be a pop-up immediately, and then I think you also get an email. So you can either wait for the email or wait until that pops up. As soon as I click done, it'll show up. Otherwise, you'll get an email. Thank you, Laura. I appreciate it. I'm glad you were able to show up tonight. Joshua, you are also very welcome. I appreciate the kind words. Nicole, thank you. Courtney, good to see you as well. Ray, I'm sure if you're the same Ray, I think I've seen you in many of our live presentations. I'm sure it's got to be you. Great to see your name again. And thanks again, Joshua. Any other questions, or remember the password? Thank you, William. Mr. Rogers, make sure that for students, make sure you email that to your instructor. For those of you who are in Art 1000, you have to do the Art 1000 for extra credit, unfortunately. So I mean, for those of you in my class, since I posted it in my class, I'm happy to give you extra credit. Remember, you only get 30 points anyway, so but I'm more than happy to give you extra credit in my class. I can't say or speak for anybody else. So you'll have to talk to your instructor to see if that's okay. But for anybody taking any other art history course, just make sure you email that to your instructor. And again, always double check that when grades are posted that ends up in the extra credit. There is actually a line for extra credit in the grade book now. So just double check and make sure, because we've got that extra credit now, it should be posted relatively immediately because it's a lot easier for us to remember it that way. Okay, well, I appreciate, sorry I was so long-winded. It's been a while since I've given this presentation, so I over-explain sometimes. All right, I'm not seeing any other questions. So I will call it a night. Enjoy your evening. Octavia, Mr. Rogers, that's the password or code right here. I don't know if you were in on the beginning. It's the 50th, I can't believe it's 50 years, 50th anniversary of the debut of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. I wanted to at least, it's always nice to have something good to talk about. Everybody loves Mr. Rogers, so. All right, if there's any questions or you, for some reason, forget the password, you can always email and double check on it or reach out to your instructor. They can get a hold of me. They know who to contact. So thank you, everybody, so much. Enjoy your evening, and I hope to see you here in the future. And for those of you in my class, I'll see you tomorrow. Oh, thanks again, Jared. I appreciate it. Good night to you, too. Thanks, Josh. All right, I'll see you all.